The green room coffee at NBC's Burbank studio tasted like burnt rubber. Bruce Lee drank it anyway. He needed something to do with his hands, something to occupy the part of his mind that kept registering the fact that 70 million people were about to watch him sit on a couch and make conversation. This was his third Tonight Show appearance that year. It had not gotten easier. If anything, it had gotten harder because Enter the Dragon had changed the scale of the thing. It turned Bruce Lee from a person who was becoming known into a person who was universally known. And that meant the 70 million were no longer curious about who he was. They already had a version of him in their heads, and the job now was to be that version, or to be something better than that version, or at minimum to survive the 20 minutes without becoming something worse. He would rather have been fighting. Fighting had clear rules and clear objectives. Television had neither. You could train for a fight. You could not train for whatever Johnny Carson might decide to ask. Linda had wanted to come. Bruce had said no. This was work he needed to approach alone, without the additional weight of monitoring someone else's experience of it. She stayed home with Brandon and Shannon while he sat in the green room and drank terrible coffee and waited. The production assistant came in with 5 minutes on the clock. Young woman, clipboard, headset, the specific expression of someone managing 17 simultaneous things. She told him he was on after the commercial break, that Mr. Frazier was already out there, and that he should need nothing except to be ready. Bruce registered the name and let it settle. Joe Frazier, the heavyweight champion, the man who had beaten Ali, the man who had said in various public settings over the previous year that Kung Fu was fake, that martial artists were dancers, that Bruce Lee was a movie star pretending to be a fighter. Joe Frazier had opinions about Bruce Lee, and none of them were good, and Bruce was apparently about to share a couch with him in front of 70 million people, which was information that would have been useful before tonight. He stood up, straightened his dark shirt, and walked toward the stage entrance. The monitor in the corridor showed Johnny with Joe in the first guest chair. Joe was in a good suit, looking comfortable and confident and large in the way heavyweight champions look large, filling the space with the specific authority of someone who has proven himself against the best available opposition. Johnny was asking about training and upcoming fights, the expected questions, and Joe was giving the expected answers, charismatic, at ease, entirely in his element. This was Joe Frazier performing Joe Frazier for an appreciative audience. He was good at it. The commercial break came, and Bruce walked through the curtain. The audience applauded warmly. People knew him and were glad to see him. That was something. He crossed to Johnny, shook hands, then turned toward Joe and extended his hand in the standard gesture of greeting between two adults sharing the same stage. Joe looked at the hand and did not take it. He did not acknowledge it. He did not speak. He simply looked at Bruce, then away, as if the hand, and the person attached to it, had not registered sufficiently to require a response. Bruce stood there for a moment with his hand out, 70 million people watching, and then he lowered it and sat down in the second chair. The second chair. Joe was in the first, closest to Johnny, the position of primary guest. Bruce was further away, secondary, which was either a production decision or the natural consequence of having a champion in the room. But the visual communicated what it communicated, regardless of the intent behind it. Johnny made the introduction with visible effort at lightness. Two legends, he said. Two different fighting worlds. This should be interesting. He asked Joe whether he knew Bruce's work. Joe turned and looked at Bruce with the expression of someone who has been waiting to say something and has now been given the opening. He said he had seen the movies. He said what he saw was choreography and camera tricks and performance, not fighting. He said real fighting was what he did in the ring, against real opponents, against genuine danger, against everything that actually tested you. He said Bruce was an entertainer, which was fine, which had value, but which was not the same thing as being a fighter. And the problem was that people confused the two. They looked at Bruce performing martial arts on screen and assumed Bruce could actually fight. Assumed the movie version of Bruce Lee was equivalent to what Joe did professionally. It was not. They were different things, different categories, and he was here to clarify the distinction. The studio went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a show moving between topics, but the uncomfortable silence of a room in which someone has just said something that cannot be unsaid. Johnny tried to redirect, reaching for the soft ground of acknowledging Bruce's talent, suggesting Joe had to concede some respect for what Bruce accomplished on screen. Joe interrupted. He did not have to do anything. He was not going to pretend choreography was combat, movie magic and real fighting were not comparable, and he was tired of the confusion. Bruce was a movie star. He was a real fighter. Those were observable facts, stated clearly so everyone could understand. Bruce sat through all of it without reacting, not performing composure, actually composed, in the way that takes decades to develop. The ability to absorb a sustained public attack without the body communicating distress or the face communicating the desire to respond. Joe wanted engagement. Joe wanted Bruce to get defensive, to need to prove something, to validate the confrontation by treating it as something that required a fight for resolution. Staying still and controlled was not passivity. It was refusal, a refusal to give Joe the thing Joe was reaching for. But silence had its own costs, and Bruce could read them clearly. 70 million people watching Bruce Lee sit quietly while Joe Frazier called him fake could read the silence as agreement, as an inability to mount a defense, as Bruce accepting the characterization by not contesting it. That was the trap that silence created, and it was as real as the trap that engagement created. Bruce turned and looked at Joe directly. He said he understood Joe valued boxing, valued real fighting, had proven himself against the best available competition, and that he respected all of that fully, without reservation. Then he said he did not understand why Joe could not extend the same acknowledgement to what Bruce had spent his life developing. Not to the movies specifically, but to the training behind them, the testing behind them, the 26 years of work that had produced what the cameras recorded. What he did was different from boxing, not equivalent to boxing, but tested in its own way, legitimate on its own terms. Why was that not something Joe could recognize? Joe said legitimate was not the word he would use for choreography. That Bruce was either lying to himself or lying to everyone else. That the confusion between entertainment and reality was a mistake he was there to correct. That Bruce was a fraud who should stop pretending otherwise. The words were designed to produce a specific reaction, and Bruce could see the design clearly. The choice in front of him was between absorbing the attack and letting it stand, which confirmed what Joe was saying, or responding in kind, which gave Joe exactly the confrontational dynamic he was looking for. Neither was good. There was a third option. "You want to know if I'm a real fighter?" Bruce asked. His voice was still controlled, but something in it had changed, sharper, more direct. The tone of someone who has finished being patient and is now saying something that matters. "You want to test that? Demonstrate it? Then let's test it right here, right now, on live television. You've been making claims. I'm offering you the opportunity to prove them. You think I won't last 20 seconds? Prove it. Stop talking about it and prove it. Test me. Fight me. Show the 70 million people watching that you're right about everything you've said. Or don't. But if you don't, then stop making claims you're unwilling to support. Stop attacking people on television when you're not willing to back it up. Show us which you are, the fighter you claim to be, or someone who only attacks people who aren't going to hit back." The studio went silent in a different way than before. Bruce had just challenged Joe Frazier on live television. And he had done it by flipping the terms of the confrontation entirely, by making Joe the person whose credibility was at stake, the person who needed to demonstrate something, the person whose talk was currently unsupported by anything except talk. Joe had built his attack on the premise that Bruce was all image and no substance. Bruce had just created a situation in which Joe was all claim and no proof, and the only way out was to either accept the challenge or acknowledge he was doing exactly what he'd accused Bruce of doing. Joe stood up, his chair scraping back. He was on his feet with the physical energy of someone who does not have a composed response available and is falling back on presence and volume. He said he would destroy Bruce, would prove everything in the first real punch, would demonstrate in less than 20 seconds that everything he had said was true. Bruce would be on the floor and everything would be proven and 70 million people would see it. He said it with the specific aggression of someone who has been cornered and is trying to make the size of his reaction compensate for the weakness of his position. Bruce stood slowly, deliberately, with the specific energy of someone who had already made all the decisions and was simply executing them. He matched Joe's physical presence with the opposite quality: complete stillness, complete control, complete composure. The contrast was visible. One man in the frame was reactive, loud, driven by his emotional state. The other was entirely still, entirely controlled, demonstrating through his body alone the difference between someone who had training and someone who had mastery. Johnny was on his feet, begging them to remember they were on a talk show. Bruce cut through it, not looking at Johnny, keeping his focus on Joe. What 70 million people were currently watching was Joe Frazier, heavyweight champion, refusing to back up the claims he had been making. That was what the moment was revealing. The question was whether Joe was going to prove his claims or continue standing there making them. The stage lights flickered. A technical issue, a power surge, something created a brief moment of chaos in the studio, and security moved immediately. They were on the stage before anyone had fully processed what was happening, separating the two men, creating physical barriers, doing the job they were there to do. The director called for a commercial from the control room, and the feed cut. One moment there was live television, the next there was a network logo and whatever advertisement filled the break. 70 million people sat in front of their televisions and experienced the specific confusion of a broadcast cut that communicates something significant has happened without explaining what. The show did not return to Bruce and Joe. The remainder of the broadcast moved on to other guests, other topics, other things. The confrontation was simply absent from what followed, as if it had not occurred. Bruce was escorted out through a different exit, security on either side, the professional management of a situation that needed to be contained before it became something that generated legal exposure for everyone involved. He went without protest, without demanding anything, without anything except accepting that the evening was over and that the network had made its decision. Joe left through a different door. The producers conferred with lawyers. The control room made whatever archival decisions needed to be made. The 70 million people who had been watching were left with a cut feed and the knowledge that something had been happening before it was stopped. The story could not be contained by a broadcast cut. About 200 people had been in that studio, and they talked, and the people they talked to talked, and the account moved through Hollywood and the martial arts community and the boxing world with the specific velocity of a story that people could not fully confirm but could not disbelieve either. It accumulated the details that all circulating stories accumulate. It changed in specific ways in specific tellings while retaining a central structure that everyone who passed it along understood to be its core. Bruce Lee and Joe Frazier had been on The Tonight Show together. Joe had called Bruce fake and refused to shake his hand and spent most of the interview attacking him. Bruce had responded by challenging Joe to prove his claims rather than simply make them. Something had escalated to the point where security intervened and the network cut the feed and made sure the confrontation did not exist in the recorded broadcast. What had been deleted could not be fully known by anyone who was not there. What circulated was the account of the people who were there, filtered through the distortions that eyewitness accounts always carry. What became fixed was the shape of the event, the refusal of the handshake, the public attack, the challenge and the counter-challenge, the security intervention, the cut feed, and what that shape implied about the two men at the center of it. Joe had come into the studio with a clear plan: to diminish Bruce Lee publicly, to draw a sharp and visible line between his boxing credentials and what he characterized as Bruce's performance credentials, to make the distinction a matter of record for the 70 million people watching. He had executed the first part of the plan successfully. He had refused the handshake, but he had made his claims on camera, specific, sustained, unapologetic. What he had not accounted for was Bruce's response, which did not fit the script Joe had prepared for: a defensive Bruce, an angry Bruce, a Bruce rattled by the public attack. Any of those would have validated Joe's characterization of him as someone whose image was the product of careful management rather than genuine capability. The Bruce who had actually responded had done something else. He had taken Joe's attack and converted it into a demand. He had placed the burden of proof on the person making the claims, had done it calmly and precisely, without any of the emotional charge Joe had been trying to produce. And then he had stood up slowly and calmly while Joe stood up loudly and urgently, providing the audience with a visual comparison that communicated something without requiring words. The evening produced no verified footage, no documented outcome, no publicly available record of what had been said after the feed cut. It produced instead a story, which was, in some ways, more durable than footage. A story that asked people to imagine what had happened in the studio while the cameras were off. What had been said in the moment the network decided 70 million people should not see. What the two men had said to each other in the controlled chaos of security intervention and producer conference and the managed separation of two people who had come closer to testing their respective claims than anyone in that building had been prepared for. Bruce Lee died in July 1973. The confrontation at NBC Burbank, whenever it occurred, became one of the events people folded into the larger account of who he had been, an account the films contributed to, the training demonstrations contributed to, the various private and public encounters with challengers and skeptics contributed to. The Tonight Show incident was different from most of those in one specific way: it had happened on live television, in front of the largest possible audience, and it had been deleted. That deletion became part of the story. The network choosing to cut the feed rather than let the audience see what was happening communicated something about what was happening, even if it specified nothing. It told 70 million people that something had been prevented, and it left them to imagine what, filling the gap with the accounts that circulated afterward. That Bruce Lee had not been the person Joe Frazier expected to find when he attacked. That the composure had been real. That the challenge had been precise. That when security moved between them and the director called for the cut, one of the two men in the frame had been entirely still and entirely controlled. And it was not Joe Frazier. That was what the story preserved. Not the outcome of a test that never happened, but the evidence of who the two men were in the moment before it was stopped, the specific quality of how Bruce had moved through the attack, absorbed it, turned it and stood up, chair scraped back, fully prepared to let 70 million people watching decide which man in that studio was operating from genuine confidence, and which was operating from something else. The network made sure they never had to decide. The feed cut. The moment was deleted. The confrontation became legend precisely because it could not be fully known, only described, only reconstructed from the accounts of the people who had been there, only imagined by everyone else. That imagination has been running for decades. The handshake that Joe refused. The attack that Bruce absorbed. The challenge that Bruce issued. The security intervention. The cut feed. The deleted broadcast. The story that spread anyway, carried by the people who were there, and the people they told, and the people those people told, through the martial arts community, the boxing world, Hollywood, everywhere the names Bruce Lee and Joe Frazier were recognized. Which was everywhere. The question Joe had come to that studio to answer, who was real and who was fake, who was fighter and who was entertainer, who could back it up and who was only image, went officially unanswered. The feed was cut before the test happened. But the question was answered in a different way, in the manner and quality of what the two men did before security arrived. And people who heard the story from the people who had been in the studio generally agreed on which answer it suggested. Bruce Lee had been called a fraud on national television. He had declined to respond reactively. He had waited. He had turned the accusation into a challenge that put Joe in an impossible position. And he had stood up calmly while Joe stood up loudly. That was what the people in the studio reported. That was what the story preserved. That was what the network had cut. And what could not be fully deleted, because the people who had witnessed it could not be prevented from saying what they had seen. The legend of the deleted Tonight Show broadcast is the legend of that gap. Between what the network broadcast and what happened in the studio. Between the official record and the accounts of the witnesses. Between what 70 million people were allowed to see and what the people in the room had actually watched. It lives in that gap, and in the question the gap contains, and in the answer the question implies, if you follow the story to its most honest conclusion. Joe said Bruce would not last 20 seconds. The feed cut before 20 seconds elapsed. Whatever that means about what was going to happen is something only the people in that studio know. And they have been telling the story for decades, in a way that consistently suggests the same thing.